Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to this latest edition of our Love in the Time of Corona video series. It turns out that we recorded a version of this yesterday, but because of technological difficulties, we had a hard time getting it onto YouTube last night, and so we're back and we're doing it again. So welcome to all of you. It's welcome back to us. There are an awful lot of people out there right now who are working really, really hard to make sure that all of us in this really, really difficult and unprecedented moment have all of the things that we depend upon to make our lives or help our lives continue in place in one form or another. There are people out there making sure that our food distribution system is working. There are people out there making sure that we have oil and heating for our homes. There are all kinds of people working to make sure we have what we need in this unprecedented moment, all the way from local organizations all the way up to governments. But I think some of the biggest things that we're all going to need as we go through this particular moment are deep emotional and spiritual resources. This is a time that we're going to have to go deep into our lives. We're going to need to go deep into our faith practices. We're going to need to go deep into our individual practices and habits. And we're going to need to go deep into the recesses of our hearts to carry us through this particular time. And I think in order to do that, we're going to need to gather all of the wisdom that we can around us. So that's why we're initiating this series of midweek, or in this case, pushing into the later part of the week, conversations. Every week, what I want to do is to tap into some of the wisdom keepers that are with us in our community, inviting some honored community members and guests to share with us some of their resources and wisdom that they've accrued through long years of experience. I think it's going to be something that's going to help us to practice well this thing that we're calling love in the time of Corona. So for our first conversation, I've invited two very special guests to be with us. These are people that are near and dear to my heart. I am sure they are near and dear to many of our hearts in this community. And so without keeping it mysterious any longer, let me share with you who we're going to be talking to today. And so here we are. With me today are people, again, that I think are going to be very, very familiar to those of us in the FCCOL community. If you aren't familiar with the FCCOL community, you might be happening to watch in some other part of the world. I want to introduce to you my two very, very good friends and colleagues, David Good and Carleen Gerber. So David, for those of you who may not know, was the senior minister of this congregation for 37 years. He currently serves as the president of our Tree of Life outreach ministry, and David is a friend to me and to many in our community. So David, thank you for being here. And Carleen Gerber, again, many of you will know, but Carleen has been in this community for 42 years and is still active on our ministry team. And she too has a great deal of wisdom and experience to share. And so again, I just want to thank both of you for being here, not once, but twice. Thank you for doing this again. I feel like yesterday we captured lightning in a bottle. So the trick is going to be whether or not we can capture lightning in a bottle for a second time. And I actually believe that we can. So let me begin just by asking the two of you, how are you, and how are things in your households, in your lives, in your neck of the woods? David, how are you getting by up in Lyme?
Well, we have a new puppy. Sophie is her name, and she keeps us very, very active out there, walking in the woods every day, early in the morning. But I want to, first of all, thank Steve and thank Carleen and Laura and all the members of the church staff. Odile is here helping with the filming, as well as Mary Tomasette. And I wanted to say how much I appreciate what the church is doing and reaching out and trying to build a sense of community during this time in which we're practicing social distancing. That's a real challenge, and I've been so grateful for the creativity and the kindness and the love that the leadership has shown. And a special word of thanks to the Board of Deacons, who have taken it upon themselves to call all of our church members, which I think is an extraordinary measure. In fact, just before coming here, I received an email from one of our former members who lives in Florida now, and she tuned into the worship service online just a couple of days ago, and was so grateful for that, and wanted me to convey her appreciation to all of you, so thank you.
That's good. Carleen, before we turn to you, I just want to note that we are doing our best to practice responsible social distancing here. I think we're about 6 feet apart. We're going to continue trying to do that for as long as it seems responsible to do so. We're doing our best to communicate with all of you in a way that feels responsible to our own lives. But Carleen, how are you doing?
So, I miss little kids. Grandchildren come to visit us frequently, and of course they can't or shouldn't and don't. But I spend time playing out in the garden and admiring daffodils and hellebores and keep myself optimistic by walking. So, but it's a strange time.
It's a strange time. For me, I know I passed through moments of disbelief and moments of acceptance, and just being outdoors and going running has been really, really helpful for me. But I hope all of you are finding ways to stay human and to stay connected to some kind of humanizing practice in this particular moment. So one of the things that's been on my mind are the theological themes that we might turn to in this particular moment, in this particular era. Themes from our church's history, from the history of theology, and from the Bible. And I'm just curious, just speaking to both of you, where do your minds go at this particular moment? What resources have you turned to, or have you been turning around in your mind? David, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, to sum it up in one word, the word that comes to my mind is the word exile. A very biblical word that you see time and time again throughout the pages of the Old Testament and the New Testament. In fact, earlier this morning I was thinking about the fact that we're in the season of Lent, which remembers the 40 days that Jesus spent out in the wilderness, basically in a time of exile from his community up in Nazareth, in exile from his family, and that time was a time of preparation for his ministry as he tried to prepare himself for the ministry. And there were all kinds of temptations that he faced, just the same as we face temptations now. It's very hard to be in community and not reach out a hand and shake the hands of the other person. And it's very tempting to kind of pull the covers up over our heads and pretend that this doesn't exist, but it does exist. And so in a very real way, we are in a time of exile. Those of you that are listening in, I really appreciate you listening in, and I don't feel comfortable around cameras or microphones. We did a good job of destroying them yesterday. But appreciate everybody's efforts to try again today. And I think it requires that in order to maintain some sense of community. Sitting here beneath the pulpit, which I loved for many years, standing in that pulpit, and being here reminded me of Howard Wells, who was our minister here back in the 1920s, 100 years ago. And he stood in this pulpit and he said, you know, this square yard that I'm standing in, this is one of the most sacred places in all of creation for me. And that was early in my ministry. But as the years went by, I came to appreciate those words more and more. And not only the pulpit, obviously, but this meeting house, where we have no idea how blessed we are with the beauty and architectural integrity of this place. And it's our home, it's our spiritual home. And so now to be separated from this home does feel like a sense of exile. And so it's out in that exile that we learn the true measure of our faith. I've often said that the true measure of our faith is not in our tonsil strength to express our words and our creeds as clearly as we want to, but rather in the tensile strength of our faith. Not the tonsil strength, but the tensile strength. And so this is a time for us to be out in the wilderness as Jesus was, and hopefully preparing ourselves for a new and better future for us all.
I think that's a beautiful theme to think about, especially in the season of Lent. And it certainly reminds me of the ways in which moments of exile, moments of crisis have always been turning points and invitations for people of faith to reconfigure themselves and to renew themselves and to gather new resources and to perhaps reinvent how we exist. So yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of understanding what we're going through right now. Carleen, I'm curious for you. I don't know, what has sprung to mind for you in the last week or 2 weeks or however long this has been?
So I've been thinking about what the disciples were faced with right after the crucifixion. You know, in many ways they knew what was going to happen and yet they didn't. And so they gathered after Jesus was crucified sometime later and tried to figure out where to go. If you read the book of Acts, you'll see that they pondered what on earth they were going to do because they lived in a time of confusion. So I think of this also as a very confusing time. I'm not sure that we know what is going to be called for us to have to do, but I think of the strength that they have from one another. I think it's awkward to find strength by phone and by internet, but it's what we have. So I'm grateful for that, and that's where I'm thinking.
Yeah. Well, one of the great strengths of this community and of this congregation has been this series of historic partnerships that the two of you have worked on developing for many, many years. And indeed, one of the reasons that I was so attracted to joining this community some 7 years ago was that history of partnership and realizing the legacy that had been developed over many, many years in this congregation. And so I'm wondering if right about now we might learn from our partnerships and from the strength that they have shown to us over many, many years now. And so David, I wonder where your mind goes as you think back across the nearly 40 years of partnerships with folks out at Green Grass in the Cheyenne River Reservation, or in South Africa, or in Haiti, or in Palestine and Israel. I'm wondering where your mind turns and if there are stories or lessons or learnings that you have that, I don't know, that you think would be helpful for this particular moment. Tell me what your thoughts are there.
Well, thank you, Steve. I think that's a very good question. I think there's a lot that we can learn from our mission partners. They live in crisis all the time, and we certainly are in a crisis as a human family as we sit here. And so we can think about our partners out there in various places, and I brought reminders of our various partners that are up here with me, and they all tell stories to me. We're all looking for ways to navigate our way through this difficult time. And I brought with me a very conventional, very familiar form of navigation. This is a GPS unit. A lot of people now have this built into their cars, but this has bailed me out of all kinds of situations in the past. And if I'm finding my way through an urban area and I don't know the way, then I've called upon the GPS unit, and it's been very helpful. It can also lead you astray. Many of our congregation know that if you put in 2 Ferry Road in here, it might end up taking you about 7 or 8 miles further to the north to Headline to a very different ferry road. So you need to be careful with that.
We've had many weddings delayed for that reason.
But what we're talking about here is really inner navigation. And I was thinking about that biblically. If you look at the pages of the Bible, you see how exile is spelled out again and again and again. But one of the prominent stories in the Old Testament is the story of the Israelites and escaping from their slavery in the land of Egypt and looking for a new and better future for themselves, the land of promise. And we knew that it took them about 40 years to wander through the wilderness, another wilderness time. How did they find their way? And the Bible says they looked to a cloud by day and a fire by night. It meant that they needed both in order to find their way so they could travel both day and night. So that cloud by day and a fire by night. We'll have to save the fire by night for another occasion, but for today, I'd like for us to think about our partners in mission as being like a cloud that can help us to navigate our way through this time of crisis. I was thinking about, completely separate from our mission partnerships, I was thinking about Robert Coles and his great series, Children of Crisis. That was really a great opportunity for us to learn from children who have experienced tremendous crisis in their lives. The classic example of that being Ruby Bridges.
Yes.
Ruby Bridges was one of the first children to break the color barrier down in the South, walking past angry mobs that were shouting all kinds of epithets to her, angry dogs that were nipping at her heels, and she showed the capacities for the human spirit to move on in spite of that intimidation. A corollary to the passage about a cloud by day and a fire by night is that passage from Hebrews where it says, "Let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us." I don't think we can understate that we are in a race. We're in a race against time, a race against a terrible disease that is spreading across the earth. We're in a race against it's our humanity against our inhumanity. But if we look to the cloud of witnesses who have come before us, they can guide us in that race and make sure that we're running it in the right way. So I'd like to turn to the first of my illustrations. The photograph above me is a photograph of Eunice Larrabee. The photograph was done by a member of our congregation, Bob Patterson, on one of our very first trips out to green grass on the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. I remember very clearly the day that we sat in the Harriet Hoag room as our Board of Missions and talked about missions. And we decided there's got to be a better way, there's got to be a different way to be engaged in missions. We don't have time to go into the history of missions generally, and certainly not even within the life of our congregation. But 300 years ago, it was a very condescending, very arrogant, and I would have to say a very arrogant way of engaging in ministry, where people from here went out there to Cheyenne River and to other places and tried to Christianize the so-called heathen. And they were punished if they spoke their Lakota language. They were told to turn their back on their Native American spirituality, and they were told that all of that was of the devil. And that was a very condescending and very violent, and people of Cheyenne River are still suffering from that very violent theology way of engaging in ministry. And then that sort of evolved to more of a liberal understanding of missions, where we're a community of affluence and therefore we need to share our wealth with those who are downtrodden. Again, it's sort of a Lady Bountiful kind of way of being engaged in missions, very condescending, without realizing that there's a lot that we can learn from those other places. So we were quite intentional at that time, and Steve has used that word, and I think it's very important for all of us to keep on using that word with regard to our mission partnerships. And that is that they need to be mutually beneficial and mutually enriching. We can't talk, it's not our place to talk about what those partnerships mean to them, but we certainly can talk about what their mission, what being in partnership with them means to us. And we need to offer our prayers of thanksgiving for that. And for me, this is one of those occasions, because now as we find ourselves in crisis, we can learn from those who live in poverty, live in crisis, live in a state of exile, live in a state of being separated, alienated from so much of the rest of our society. And for the Native Americans who were herded onto a reservation, separated from their sacred land, they can be our wisdom teachers at this time. And here is a wonderful example of that, Eunice Larrabee. Just a couple of stories about Eunice. She carries herself with great dignity and strength. Her father, grandfather were healers. They used herbs as healing. She was very attuned to life on the reservation, very proud of her Lakota traditions, very proud of the Lakota language. We first met her on one of our very first journeys out there. We were camping out at the Greengrass Church. Nobody was there. And so we said, well, what are we doing here? We might as well get up and go for a walk. So we walked across the prairie and came back, and there was Eunice, together with a lot of the other people of that community, preparing a wonderful taco meal for all of us. And nobody spoke until Eunice spoke, and that broke the ice. And then everybody was leaning against walls, sitting down and sharing coffee and conversation with each other. And Eunice, we had many different chapters in our relationship with her. We went out there in wintertime, and I stayed in her house and had the honor of her hospitality. And at the giveaway, as they would call it, that year, she presented me with these moccasins, beautiful dancing shoes. And one of the stories that we treasure in our friendship with the Native American community of Cheyenne River is the story of Eunice and how she was instrumental in bringing not only community colleges and libraries to the people of our community, but also clean water. The story has it that she took a pair of moccasins nowhere near as beautiful as these, that had holes in the bottom. And she boarded an airplane, and she went out to Washington, D.C., and she brought with her a glass of very dirty water. And to all the politicians she met there, she said, "Here, have a glass of water." And of course, they all turned it down. And then she said, "You know, I've worn a hole in my shoes coming back and forth to politicians trying to bring clean water to my reservation."
Wow. Yeah.
Look at the strength of her face, look at the strength of her spirit, and give a prayer of gratitude for the fact that she helped to bring clean water to the people of Green Grass. And now for those that go out there, you see a beautiful, I don't know how beautiful it is, but it's certainly functional. A great water tower that now provides an ample amount of clean water. And that's all very much indebted to the legacy of Eunice Larrabee.
Oh, it's great. It's a great story. Yeah, share another. One of the things that I love about David, by the way, is that he always comes with a series of icons, a series of objects that he uses to tell these stories. And so in this case, he came with a backpack full of these object lessons and stories that he could share with us. So tell us another, if you would.
Let me just tell you, one of the things David taught me was that the symbol gives rise to thought, right? That's Ricoeur, a philosopher. So in this time of trouble, I've started moving things around in my house that make me think of things, like a statue that I bought in Palestine, or something so that every day I have a different focal point. So go, David.
Okay, so we have another icon now.
We have another icon.
Well, this is a symbol that will give rise to some people getting up out of their seats and disappearing from the room altogether. This New York Yankees cap really has nothing to do with the story that I want to tell, but I would happen to be wearing this particular hat on a day that I was walking through the ancient city of Nablus in Palestine. Nablus actually is a corruption on the word Neapolis, which means new city. But it's one of the principal cities in Palestine and desperately poor. One of the poorest of the refugee camps is actually in Nablus. But we were on one of our Tree of Life journeys, and I was leading the group, and I happened to be wearing this New York Yankees cap. Becky, forgive me. And we were walking through the streets of Nablus, and suddenly this man saw my cap and recognized it from the year before. And he came up, and when he got a little bit closer, I saw who it was, and it was my friend Ibrahim Khalil. Ibrahim Khalil is a Muslim man. His family, they were olive farmers for generations, beautiful old olive trees in his family. They're passed on from one generation to another. And one of our early journeys out there, we had the honor of meeting Ibrahim shortly after a terrible tragedy in his family. Again, here are people, communities in crisis. They live in a state of exile themselves. Many of them still hold keys to the homes that they used to own. Ibrahim Khalil had his own period of exile when he woke up one morning and found that settlers who lived up on the hills had come down from the hills, and they drilled holes in 300 of his 300-year-old olive trees and inserted poison in those trees and ultimately killed all of those trees. That would be terribly devastating for any olive farmer. But then on top of it, around about that same time, shortly thereafter, a settler ran over and killed one of his children while he was standing by the side of the road. And so you imagine, this is mostly our church members who were standing there with me at that time, and we're standing up on his rooftop hearing this story. And whenever anybody tells you that kind of family tragedy, there's a period of silence. Everybody is not quite sure how to respond or if to respond. And I was so very grateful that one of our church members broke the ice and said, "Well, Ibrahim, we're honored that you would tell us this story, but how is it you can even be here? How can you smile and tell stories with us and welcome us into your home, given the terrible tragedy that you've gone through?" And then to my amazement, this Muslim man from Issaouia in Palestine said, you know, I've always loved American literature. I've always loved American literature, particularly poetry. And then he went on to say, to my amazement, my favorite poet, he said, is Emily Dickinson. And then from memory, he quoted one of her poems. He said, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. So for us, as we deal with this crisis that we're going through, and as we struggle with our humanity versus our inhumanity, and wonder about and struggle between hope and hopelessness, here is a Muslim man who has gone through incredible pain, teaching us a very important lesson about hope. This is one of the great clouds of witnesses that can help us to run this race that's set before us. So I have prayers of gratitude for Ibrahim as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. It's a very, very important story to recall right now. All of these stories are. Carleen, I wanted to turn to you, and I'm curious about some of the experiences that you've shared and where you've turned for wisdom in these days.
So of course, well, you know, my love is music. So my story is going to come from South Africa and my love of her culture and her music. So I'm going to just tell you the story of having been in South Africa in 1988 while South Africa was still in a state of emergency. So police everywhere, we were not allowed to be in groups of we were in Soweto illegally. It was illegal for a white person to be in that community, which was 1 million black people, I think. But at one point, this group of 25, David and I were part of 25 travelers who were taken by an institute called the Plowshares Institute to study what the churches were doing in response to apartheid. So the state of emergency is in full force, and part of this trip we were in Cape Town, and we were there for a service in Desmond Tutu's cathedral, which was huge, I mean much bigger than this wonderful meeting house. And the speaker that day was the 12th anniversary of what was known as the Soweto Massacre, which was when the children in Soweto rose up and protested because they were forced to learn Afrikaans in school, and they wanted to learn their own language. So they flooded the streets, and the emergency police shot into the crowd. And the picture, the iconic picture that newspapers in this country ran was of a father carrying his young son who was 5 or 6 or 7 years old, who was dead, and running toward a camera. And that was one of the things that got the world's attention about the issues of apartheid. So David and I are in this cathedral in Cape Town, and it was full of people. And Hector Peterson's mother got up to speak, the 12th anniversary of his death. And it was, the building was filled with sound and with music and with prayers and with preaching. And we knew that outside that cathedral there were, what do we call those? Hippos, they call them, like tanks with policemen. And their technique back then was to shoot people with water cannons. So we knew that when we exited that cathedral, there would be water cannons waiting for us. But as the service ended, the entire cathedral broke into this song, which was the national anthem of the new South Africa, or the black South Africa. It's called Nkosi Sikeleli. It was written by a Methodist minister, and it's a prayer for the nation, that God will lead the nation out of exile and oppression. So I'd like to play it for you, but before I play you the beginning of this, I just want you to imagine that as they opened the doors, and all these folks, most of them black, but some of them white who were there to protest, flooded out the doors into the streets. And because they kept singing, and they would put up their fist and holler, Amanla, which was power to the people. We were almost shielded by the sound and the spirit of the music. So I thought I'd like to just play a little bit of this for you.
Africa, Manu Baba.
literally, I can't hear that played without it making me teary. It had so much power and still does. And that experience that we had in 1988 led to an invitation to invite the entire choir, 53-member choir of the Central Methodist Mission here to this community some 12 years later. And this church community raised the money to bring that 53-member choir to the United States, and they sang. They packed the Guard Theater in New London. They packed this meeting house twice. There was standing room only, and the building shook, vibrated with their sound. And for 2 weeks, the members of this church housed those singers and transported them and fed them, and they were brought here in part by a man named Stan Nkosi, who was this silvered-haired elder statesman who had been a music producer. And I think David, Charlie Harper might have stayed with him at a later date, but his wife had been tragically murdered in a burglary, I think. And he sort of gathered his strength and he shepherded that choir here. I'll tell you a funny story. He told those people before they came, don't embarrass the South Africans by eating food with your fingers. And of course they came, and one of the things we did is serve like chicken drumsticks, and we all picked the stuff up in our hands. And they said later they were so confused by the difference between what Stan and Cozy said they had to do and what they actually did. Anyway, it was a fabulous 2 weeks of bringing the power and enrichment of that South African culture to this community, and it was so important to them that some of them who have subsequently died, in their obituaries, they said the most important thing, the most meaningful thing I ever did in my life was go to Old Lyme, Connecticut. So it was a great, great time.
Well, two things about that really resonate, certainly with me, and I hope with a lot of other people as well, but this notion that the song in that particular moment created a shield around you, whereby you felt as though nothing could harm you, nothing could touch you, even though there was real danger. But the song itself was a shield that allowed you to move and to act and to remain human, if you will, and to do what you needed to do. The other thing that strikes me is just that it's just the image of all of those singers gathered in this meeting house, which is currently empty. And so hearing those sounds from the recording make me imagine a time where, you know, this place is filled, and a time when that will happen again. So it's helpful to think of those images right now. But David, I wanted to turn back to you and to ask, I know you have another, at least one, icon to share, and maybe talk about that a little bit, and then I think we need to wrap up our time together.
Well, I want to thank Carleen for bringing those wonderful memories of the spirit of South Africa, that the role that music played in the struggle against apartheid is awe-inspiring. And as Carleen mentioned, at the end of singing that, they would raise their fist up in the air and they say, Amandla, power to the people. And I think that's a great cloud for us to pay attention to now as we're looking for clouds of witnesses, is that if they could say that against the brutal system of apartheid, then we need to raise our fist and say, Amandla, we're well capable of overcoming all the different things pertaining to this coronavirus. So if you agree with me, say, Amandla.
Amandla.
The last thing I would share with you is what this painting represents, the spirit of the people of Haiti. A number of years ago, thanks to a wonderful member of our church here, Dr. Wayne Southwick, he was head of orthopedics at Yale University, and he had a strong connection with Hospital Albert Schweitzer. And for a number of years, he tried to encourage us to go down to Haiti, and finally prevailed on us to have a delegation that went down there. And for many years, I've been so very grateful for those pioneers in that relationship that went down there. And then Becky and Ted Crosby took it one step further by establishing the Crosby Educational Program in the community of Deschapelles. in Haiti. And I remember so well one of the children's sermons that Becky gave, sitting over there where Steve is now. And she brought in a painting similar to this, and I was blown away by what it said. I mean, here are the people of Haiti who suffer from unbelievable poverty, dating back to the time of the horrible institution of slavery, punished by the world community because of their slave rebellion, and living under the thumb of the rest of the world, ignored by the rest of the world. And yet, as this painting evokes, they still live with hope. Here they are gathering produce and bringing it back to their families. Obviously that's not the way it is, but that's the way that they dream and they hope and they live and pray that someday that will be. So I'm so very grateful for the people of Haiti and for the cloud that they provide in helping us to run the race that's set before us, that we have no excuse not to be people of hope.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for sharing these stories and for helping us all. I think all of us need these reminders right now, helping us all to remember why we can be and have the capacity to be people of hope right in this moment. In the spirit of love in the time of Corona, I think, Carleen, we need to close with a song. And as the song plays, I'm going to ask Odile and Mary, who are serving as our camera people, to pan across the meeting house here. So stop it for now, let's go back. All right, we're going to keep on going, let's go, come on. right, everyone. That brings us to the conclusion of this edition of Love in the Time of Corona. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that we'll see you soon. Remember that we love you. Remember that I love you. Have a good evening tonight.